Welcome everyone. My name is Nicolette Ellis and I am Chair of Chronic Pain Australia and here to discuss an often overlooked but critical issue, which is children living with chronic pain. Did you know that 1 in 5 children live with chronic pain, and this is the same statistics that we see in our adult population? But kids are not mini adults. Pain significantly disrupts those key developmental milestones and in particular their education. On average, children with chronic pain miss 22% of their schooling, or roughly 1 day per week. The consequences of living with pain are profound, and when kids hurt, parents suffer. This week, Chronic Pain Australia has launched a new initiative called Kids in Pain, and this is aimed at bringing much needed attention, advocacy, and hopefully action to this invisible and debilitating condition. To help us dive deeper into these challenges, I'm really honoured to be joined by Megan Gilmour, who is CEO of Missing School. Megan is a passionate advocate for the right to education, regardless of illness or disability, and brings invaluable insights as both a leader and a mother. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today on this really important topic.
Nicolette, thanks for having me on representing Missing School. We're really delighted to be able to discuss this important issue with you.
Thank you, Megan. And for those who haven't heard of Missing School, can you tell us a bit more about your organisation and maybe how it started?
Yeah, so Missing School started in 2012, started by 3 mums in a Canberra lounge room. The 3 of us had children with serious and life-threatening illnesses of some duration. And what we observed through their treatment, which involved a lot of pain, complex medical protocols, hospitalizations, was that they really longed to be at school. And whilst it's not a choice for them to have these, complex health issues or the treatments that save their lives, what they really want is to be normal. They want to be with their friends. They want to know what's going on. And so my son Darcy was really the genesis of the 3 of us getting together and starting the organisation Missing School. And here we are today.
Wonderful. And thank you, Darcy, for helping establish Missing School as well. And so what is your organisation trying to change in the system?
So it's probably good to start out by saying, we brought an evidence-based approach to this. So we had some questions when we started. One of them was, who are these kids? How many are there? How do we know what works and whose job is it? And so not long after founding, we initiated a report that we did with the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. And so that report was to basically draw out data on how many kids were in this situation, what were the evidence-based practices across Australia, and whose job was it to do this. Our mission is to solve social isolation and educational isolation for these kids, because that report found that nobody was counting them. Back then, we estimated by extrapolating from multiple data sets that it was more than 60,000 children across Australia who missed large amounts of school due to their health circumstances. And we didn't know or weren't able to find data on how much school they actually missed. We do know that the missing school matches an absence pattern, matches certain conditions. So some are long-term, some are intermittent. But again, no data really to show that in any great detail. That's still the same today, by the way. We did find that there were no evidence-based practices applied by schools across Australia for this issue, and we'll get into that a little bit later in our conversation as to why that happens. But the last thing we found was that all the legislation, education legislation and other legislation in Australia show that it is actually the responsibility of schools. So our mission is sitting around reconnecting kids to their classrooms, supporting parents with information, advice, support, bringing evidence-based practices into place in engagement with schools and education systems and even health systems, and finally doing all those good things that charities do, like fundraise. But at the heart of it was always this idea of what role technology could play. So I hope we get to talk about that too.
And such a key organisation, and so many of the points that you talked about, like the lack of data and the lack of awareness and attention, is certainly something that Chronic Pain Australia has also experienced in the parents who are coming to us saying, I don't know what to do, and how to navigate the system. And we've just found that there's just a glutton of information out there, and that if that's not in existence, then someone needs to create that information, particularly around chronic pain, because unfortunately it's so prevalent in children in Australia. So as a mother and an advocate, and with all of your experience and history in this space, Megan, where would you start as a parent? And particularly, what advice would you give to a parent who has a child with chronic pain?
Well, the first thing I want to say is you're not on your own. This is a really important aspect of this journey to realise. What our data shows us and what we learned as founders and parents who had this lived experience with our children is, second to the emotional anxiety around the condition, in this case, chronic pain, and maybe what's causing that chronic pain. The second most important thing to us is, what about education? What about school? And so you're not on your own. What we know is that there are so many parents across Australia, into the hundreds of thousands, experiencing, for different reasons, this pain, this issue. By that I mean emotional pain for their kids. So you're not alone. And it's amazing to be able to join together with organisations like Chronic Pain Australia and Missing School and many others to be able to bring this into sharp focus at this current time. And I think we have a really good opportunity to do that. I hope through the rest of our conversation we can get into some detail about what you can do once you know you're not alone.
And in your experience at Missing School and navigating this system prior to establishing Missing School, what are the sort of common misunderstandings that you think parents face or are just unknown when they're trying to navigate schooling system with either a sick child or a child with an illness?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is that whilst school is a worry, a concern for parents in these circumstances, and I mentioned not being on your own because that is a big, I guess, misunderstanding, is that we shouldn't worry about school. We should wait until they're well. And I think this is the biggest misunderstanding. We know from all the data, and there's been a lot of research done by Australian researchers and international researchers to show the outcomes for children, the effects of missing school, on top of having that, complex health situation, so health circumstance, pain that they're facing. And we know that it causes academic falling behind. We know that it causes social isolation. We know that it interferes with relationships. And we know there's a lot of anxiety and mental health circumstances that these kids also face. And there can be bullying and maltreatment and all sorts of other things. So school is really, really important. And that's because education is important, but not only education, it's the school community and belonging, having some normality. So I think this big, often misconception is that we need to just forget about school now and concentrate on resolving the health issue. But our point of view, for all the reasons I've expressed, is that it's really important to demonstrate to that young person that they matter, they're important, they're remembered, and that they have a future, and they have a positive future, and that education is the pathway to that. So we love to refer to them as students, not as patients. And you can just see the difference in that terminology around identity, and they're maintaining their identity as a kid, as an adolescent, a young person. So yeah.
And for those parents, whose responsibility is it to ensure that those education needs are met, and that, I guess, they might be met differently because of the condition that the child's living with or navigating? So whose responsibility is it ultimately to provide that education and support?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt whatsoever that it is the responsibility of our schools through our education systems. And that doesn't matter whether it's a kindergarten class or a year 12 class or anywhere in between. It doesn't matter which state or territory it's in, or which school system, whether it's public, an independent or private school system, or a Catholic or faith-based education system. It is absolutely the responsibility of our education systems through schools. So this is a really important one. Of course, it is our education legislation also holds parents responsible for getting their children to school or maintaining that school connection. And we can get into a little bit about that when we cover off why schools find it hard to provide the continuing education service when the student is not in the school, which, as you mentioned, and they're quite a confronting number there in terms of how much school is missed. And I think it's worth just adding here that anything more than 10% of school missed is considered non-negligible. The term is there's no safe threshold for absence, but anything more than 5 days per term missed, so anything more than 10% absence or less than 90% attendance, can cause issues now, but also into the future.
And when you're talking about those issues, it's the developmental or education, meeting those education needs of the child?
Yes, it's all of those things. So it's academic, it's socialization, developmental, play, all of those things that make up a child's life. And that well-being aspect covers everything from academic right through to, well, let's start with physical. They're already facing a physical issue. Then they've got a social issue on top of that, an academic issue, emotional effects, and then mental health effects. So apart from anything else, it's a child safety and protection issue from our point of view to maintain a connection to education, hopefully through a school.
Yeah. Which is, I think it would be scary for some parents who might be sitting there thinking, on average, if you have chronic pain as a child, you miss 22% of your schooling years, 1 day per week. And I guess what we find with chronic pain as well, and what the statistics and research show, is that there's always delayed diagnosis, and particularly in children. So delayed diagnosis, it appears on average, most children are diagnosed after a 2 to 3 year period of experiencing ongoing pain, which is awful to think, as a parent myself, going through the system and trying to navigate my children and get answers or a diagnosis, and possibly thinking as well in that whole period that this is just going to go away at some point. So for those parents who might be sitting there and they've been they've had a child who's had ongoing pain and they're trying to get through this, what should they be doing or expecting of their school to help support them in this space? Because I would say when we're talking about the importance of attendance of school, that this is kind of an urgency as well, that you have to figure out a system and what will work
Yeah.
for your child and the schooling system as well.
Yeah. And coming back to an earlier question, another misconception, I guess, is that parents feel like they have to work this out themselves, that if your child can't go to school or they're missing a lot of school, or if they have issues within the school, that it's up to the parent. And that's not true, because education is everyone's responsibility. So, but it's especially true in our education systems. We have a very powerful regulation called the Disability Standards for Education. And it's a powerful regulation because on top of all the other legislation that's in place and all the other good things that, our systems say about education for all and not leaving anyone behind, the thing about the disability standards is that it gets around some of the issues we face as a nation around federated states and territories where, individual systems might do things a certain way. The disability standards applies to every single school in Australia. And what it does is it enables education on the same basis as peers for children who are experiencing a disability, which includes, and it is explicitly covered by the standards, an illness or anything affecting the body, the mind. So chronic pain is covered by the disability standards for education. Families aren't often aware of that, and we wouldn't typically associate chronic pain with a disability necessarily. So we kind of broaden our thinking through the disability standards to encompass that it's not just a physical disability or a psychological disability, that in fact this is covered. And where a diagnosis doesn't exist, and we'll get into other things that the standards provides, but where a diagnosis is not in place, the standards allows for imputation. So a school or a family can impute a health or a medical condition or an illness through the standards, which means that you don't have to wait for a diagnosis. In fact, symptomology or circumstances can be enough to say that the standards kick in. And when the standards kick in, and you don't require the disability standards to have an individual education plan, but certainly the kids we're talking about here would be covered by the standards, including if they don't have a diagnosis. And then the standards enable the development of a plan that includes reasonable adjustments for that student. And those reasonable adjustments can include all sorts of things, including assistive devices that might be needed. And we talk about technology under this to connect to school. But it could be things like extensions for work submitted, longer allowances of time for an exam situation, and breaks, do you know what I mean, to accommodate pain or other things. So it's very powerful, and there's a lot of things that can fit under a reasonable adjustment. I mean, not to provide under the standards would require a school to claim that providing that support would give the school undue hardship. In most of the cases we're talking about, that would not be easy to claim for a school. So access to curriculum, access to additional support, and access to the school grounds that's what the standards covers. So when we talk about access to the school grounds as missing school, as technology providers, what we're also saying is that a student can join their class through a technology if they can't attend. And this is what we're really fighting for across Australia now, that Learn From Anywhere can be a business as usual thing for these kids when they can't be there.
And it's such an important part because living with chronic pain, a lot of the things that health professionals will be trying to teach and support in their self-management is around pacing. And I could imagine putting your kid into school from 9 to 3 doesn't enable them to pace their activities, which is something that's needed. So they might need maybe a few hours only and a flexible schooling arrangement. So are the schools open to using these kind of flexible models? And is that something that as a parent you could expect, or you expect that as a right to allowing your child to thrive despite their condition and the education needs that they have to meet as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so the first thing that's incontrovertible is that the disability standards covers these kids, and it's a regulation that applies to every single school and age grade. That's huge. The next thing is that when students are not on the school grounds and they have an approved absence for a health condition, because of the way that absences are coded, what we'll see is that schools won't associate the disability standards in many of these cases, and also isn't getting the signal from the absence code to continue an education service to that student who's outside the classroom. Schools where this connection is made clear to the schools can really rise to the occasion, to your point. And by the way, we talk a lot about what happens outside of school, but the standards apply inside the school as well.
So Megan, for people with chronic pain, a lot of what they learn is around pacing and self-management strategies. And I could imagine for a child, the traditional 9 to 3 is not going to fit within possibly what's in their chronic pain management plan that's been organised by their health professionals and their teams. So you were talking about schools and a bit of a flexible working or schooling arrangement. Is that something that schools are on board with, in changing and being a bit more flexible and malleable using technology to fit in with the needs of the child with managing that pain condition?
Yes. So just always going to come back to the disability standards here, because it applies obviously when the student's at school and also when they're not at school, and then any other alternative arrangements that might be made or that families are supported through to make decisions about, well, let's call it education, not just schooling. So we know that through the disability standards, and we've agreed that these students would be covered by the standards, that reasonable adjustments should be made. And so the example that you give on pacing would require the documentation of reasonable adjustments to match that circumstance. And what's really important, so even if there isn't a diagnosis, with the standards, what's really important is that as much information, evidence-based information, can be provided to the school, whether it's through health professionals, whether it's through, doctors or allied health professionals, organisations like your own, organisations like Missing School, where the school can build their understanding of that circumstance in order to work with the family to map out a plan that will suit the student. And of course, the student's input to that, no matter what age they are, is also really important as well. Because often we're most worried about literacy and numeracy, what might be best for that young person's well-being is that they can just maintain connection, you know, with their art class or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Where it's maintaining their identity as a student, that learning's important and all those things without burning them out on heavy academic pushes. So all of these things can be worked through, and there's a really great some really great resources on the Department of Education at the Commonwealth level, probably at state level as well. But information resources for students with disability and their caregivers. And that's been developed in consultation with, you know, stakeholders, really great organisations who have lived experience as a part of their remit. And those fact sheets and explainers and tips, all wrapped up in really neat documents, help families enormously to work out the language of schools and how to navigate that. I think that's a really important point here is we call it Learn to Speak School. So anyone of your families or anyone listening to this where their child has a health circumstance like chronic pain, when you learn to speak school, that would be, you know, asking the school, what documentation do you need so that we can develop a plan through the Disability Standards for Education? As soon as you use that language, a school knows, and even if they don't think it applies, they'll go and look it up again and they'll see that it does. And so now we're talking. And I think communication is the key here, because schools, like all organisations, are full of humans, and you'll have various levels of empathy, you'll have various levels of understanding of the standards, various levels of understanding, obviously, of chronic pain in this case. And so being able to support the school to do what they know how to do is the key to it, and maintaining those positive conversations as a family, even though it can be quite frustrating, and I want to acknowledge that, and quite hard. I also want to acknowledge that. You know, school culture can play a really big part in the outcomes. And I know you have some other points of view on this as well. So
yeah, and speaking the language, I think for parents it's hard because they've got to speak the language of health professionals and speak the language of schools, and it's a tremendous job for anyone to be doing that whilst they're seeing their child in pain and not thriving like they would love them to see. But I think you make a really good point about it's not just about the literacy and numeracy parts, it's also about the connection with people, doing activities that you love doing, whether that is art or drama or all of those sort of things, because they make good endorphins, good hormones that help actually reduce pain as well.
Yeah, and distraction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think using school as one of those tools in their toolbox for pain management too, if they feel that connection and doing the things that they love doing is such an important part. And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on is this issue of stigma that we see all the time at Chronic Pain Australia. Because chronic pain is generally an invisible condition, it is disbelieved quite often, and I think statistically speaking, it sits between that 40 to 50% mark. And we do see this with teachers as well, not believing that the child is in chronic pain, and they may be saying that, you know, they wanting to miss school, and that's the excuse for that. So if parents are coming around that sort of resistance and disbelief, what I'm sure you've probably seen it at missing school, what sort of avenues, what would you advise to how to navigate that situation?
Yeah, so stigma is a really important one, and it happens across all different types of illnesses as well, although some illnesses tend to, you know, create more attention. And that's unfortunate because it leads to deeper inequities, I guess. Um, I wanted to just and remind me what this question is if I get off track. But I wanted to just acknowledge something you said about parents and their health literacy, and now they've got to navigate this complex education system. And often if the child is receiving treatment in hospital, then you're navigating being away from home and financial stress and mental health issues as a parent yourself. Let's acknowledge the siblings here as well, who are also in an invisible sort of pain themselves, I guess, emotional pain. As much as it's frustrating for parents that is the case, we and you are the experts on your own children in terms of advocating for them, and you have to be the advocate. So I guess what we're trying to do here is to create easier pathways through that advocacy when we have these conversations. So let me just pick up what your question was. I felt compelled to say that, so sorry if I dropped off the question.
Yeah, I think it fits right in with that question as well. There's a tremendous amount of burden on parents in this space. And I guess when they're faced with people with disbelief or stigmatizing their child because of their pain condition, how would you deal with that resistance and trying to impart knowledge and education and also get what you genuinely should be getting by law to help support yourself and your child?
Yeah, so I said it at the beginning, is you're not alone, and it's always bringing as much as you can to the table from other evidence and from other supporters. And that means that if there is this stigma of disbelief, that you're trying to just annihilate that stigma through evidence, and just always coming back to the disability standards, because schools really understand their obligations under the standards, because the Disability Standards for Education sits under the Disability Discrimination Act, which sits under and is associated with Human Rights Commission and the Federal Attorney General. So it's not even in an education system. It's really around stopping discrimination and removing the barriers to access and the barriers to participation and full participation in life as a person who's experiencing, in this case, a chronic pain disability. And I reckon that many of the young people that we're talking about here, chronic pain isn't their only issue. That can often be coming off the back of another medical situation, which might have even been resolved, or indeed a physical disability that's visible. And let's just also accept the fact that these kids will come from all different backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, non-English speaking backgrounds, LGBTQIA+, there's just a whole range of intersectionality that's going on at the same time. So that's why I say that, a caring parent advocate is going to be able to be the best representative and bring together all of the other players. Is it, what kind of documentation is needed to support the school to get on board that this is not just a psychological pain? And might I say too, which is also thoroughly exhausting, is that it's constant, because school staff changes. School grades change. The student may be in and out of school, and you're coming back and you're saying, do I really have to do this again? I thought I got it resolved. And then you'll have, in different schools, you'll have, people who aren't the teacher or the teachers, but do the navigation through these things. So every circumstance is different. But I can't emphasize enough how important it is to speak the language of the standards, because once you make that central to the conversation, now you're speaking the language of schools, and you keep calling up that obligation.
And that is such key information that I don't think the general population would even know. And knowing what the carrot is half the battle in these spaces as well. So I think you articulated it really well. Always talk about the Disability Act, and very validating to know that chronic pain is part of the Disability Act, and it is a recognised condition under that, even if you don't have a diagnosis yet.
Yeah.
And all of those things are so key to our parents and the children that they have who live with chronic pain. So it's unfortunate that people have to tire themselves out so much to advocate for this in this space, but
yeah, and I think
it's
as you said, you use the carrot there too. It's always great to be at the table having a conversation, even if that conversation has to go on and on. It's better than nothing. It's better than doing nothing or not having any conversations. And I think I know we're living now in a time where chronic absence due to a health circumstance has really come to the forefront. And we have a platform now, including wide-scale application of trauma-informed practice in schools. So we're going to see this more and more, and I feel for this audience it's really important to grab onto that too, because you talked about stigma, you talked about, not being believed. These are all things that come from a lack of understanding, and that is what is recognised now, that is re-traumatizing students who are already experiencing a trauma to do with their health circumstance or their disability, or their association and identification with any of those other circumstances and groups that we talked about. So trauma-informed practice, I think we're going to see in the next 5 years, and I know it'd be great if it was just all good today, but we are on the trajectory to have schools being much more, not just cognizant, but trained in the application of this, using evidence. So I hope that some of that will ease, and that people can hang in there knowing that this is coming online as well.
A really important point that I want to call out is that I think many parents are told, keep your child in school. Taking them out of school is the worst thing that you can do to your child when they have chronic pain, and that's not necessarily always true. And I think when you're talking about that trauma, this is traumatic for parents as well, and trying to do the best for their children. And I think deeply parents understand what is best for their child, and some of them make the decision, and rightfully make the decision, that the mainstream education system is not built for their child, and it's not helping them, and it's not allowing them to live well despite having chronic pain and meet their education needs. So for those parents who make those kind of really, really tough and challenging decisions, which would just be those heart sink decisions, I don't think any parent would take it lightly. What options do they have, or pathways? Like how would you sort of set up your child so that hopefully we're not missing developmental needs that they have? Can they access that outside of a mainstream education system?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a complex answer, because there's no one size fits all. I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing is to acknowledge that any parent who's coming to that decision is keeping my child connected to their regular school, their own school, their community school, the right thing, as you say, has gone through a lot of energy, effort, contemplation, engagement with the school in order to be arriving at that place. And I mean, that already suggests that there's a lot of evidence for the parent there to draw on. So I want to also acknowledge that all that the hard work they've done in that respect is not for nothing, because it's leading them to these decision points that are about what's going to be best. So we have, I guess, virtual schools emerging now that are actually they're distance education schools that operate on technology now rather than correspondence via paper back in the old days. And so many parents would see that as an alternative. I think there's probably going to be more tolerance around hybrid models where a child could potentially stay associated with their community school, and also switch to part-time distance education, whilst that might not be permissible in some states now in terms of enrolment and how enrolment works. From our point of view, it's always important to try and maintain a connection with some kind of education system that offers the national curriculum and train teachers through the national curriculum, because that's, in our opinion, possibly going to provide the best outcome for kids. And a lot of families can't afford tutoring from private sector organisations. So I think if mainstream schooling isn't proving to be supportive, then distance education options, registered homeschooling, which I think is a very brave thing for a parent in these circumstances to undertake. But I would also just think about trying to see if technology connections can be maintained with a regular school. In cases where that is enabled and does work, it's because the school is really geared up to provide everything they can to students in those circumstances, and the school culture suits it. So that's a very vague answer.
Is there ways that, so can parents get in touch with Missing School to get information or ask these kinds of questions or get individual case management? Is that something that...
Yeah, so absolutely. Definitely get in touch with us. We offer technology connections. We will be moving more and more out of providing the technology ourselves and more into brokering with schools and systems, and through policy change at the national level to have learn from anywhere where students can't attend school. It's not truancy. It's not the student disengaged from school, for nefarious means or whatever. It's actually that they wish they could be and want to be but can't. So we definitely try and support families through that process and can provide technology at the moment. So and we're always prepared to give parents guidance based on our evidence. So what we've collected over 6,500, 7,000 data points on this now. We have the largest data set in the world. So we have a lot of experience in order to guide families through their decision making and help them maintain connection to the school system or navigate through options. Yeah.
Wonderful. Megan, this has been such an amazing conversation. I think you really broke down some key information, particularly for parents, around how to navigate this situation. For me, it's, the carrot of the Disability Act and learning to speak schools is number one on the list. It's really validating that chronic pain is part of that Disability Act and seen as a condition that's covered under that Disability Act, despite you might feel some stigma or disbelief from other teachers, but it's something that you can go back to, and certainly Chronic Pain Australia would advocate for that as a seen condition in the schooling system. And also looking at different models of how children can still access and stay connected with the education system in like flexible arrangements that we're all doing as adults in our working life.
Absolutely. Hybrid
And
and flexible.
yeah, and that should be always available to parents. And I hope this has been really validating for a lot of people out there who might be going through a very difficult time. Megan, have you got some final thoughts that you wanted to add to a great conversation?
My final thoughts are just to keep believing in your child, keep fighting for them, and know that you're more powerful than you can imagine. Once you get hold of the right tools. So big encouragement to all of the parents out there who are supporting their kids. And I do just want to acknowledge our data shows this. Most of those parents are mums. And, we want to recognise that journey is incredibly difficult. But you are definitely the right person for the job. So keep going. Don't give up.
Wonderful. And thank you from the bottom of our heart, from Chronic Pain Australia, Megan, to be connected with Missing School and have you today to break down this very complex and challenging topic to navigate. Chronic Pain Australia is also launching a Kids in Pain social connection group as well this week. And we also have our Carers in Pain support group. And there's lots of different resources that you can find on our website, which is kidsinpain.org.au, if you're also trying to navigate this space. And thank you again, Megan.
Thank you. And the social connection is the key. Thanks for all you do at Chronic Pain Australia. It's been wonderful having this conversation with you.
Wonderful.